Complete harmony in every group. I found in America when orchestration was emphasized, a lot of times it's more instrumentation. A lot of people talk about the timbre or the pairing of instruments, but really it's all about harmony. Notice we have a fully diminished chord, it gets an F minor chord. So that's going to be clear orchestrationally. So the F quasi minor chord is in the double basses and the cellos. We have a fully diminished chord in all the woodwinds as well as the strings for reinforcement. Be really wary of searching for strange or weird effects just to be different or cool or original. I find this is an unfortunate tendency in a lot of conservatories, but the reality is when it comes to orchestration, it has to be really clear and easy to understand for the listener. One thing you're going to have to think about is how to divide up the chord, because I do not have 4 flutes that I can place this entire chord in. So look what I did. I have the flutes on the top of the chord and the clarinets on a very light register where they blend really well on the bottom. So the effect may be that the listener kind of assumes that there are 4 flutes and really it's been divided. Also notice that with the strings, I had to put them concertino so they don't overpower the woodwinds. They're more there in the background. They're also there for a timbral effect, and they're also there to help clarify the harmony so that we have a link between the two sections. Let's talk about the harmonic context of a dissonance. I find that a lot of modern composers, especially those that have a lot of dissonance in their works, when they proceed to orchestrate, it actually sounds really thin. One of the problems with dissonance is that if you do not voice it correctly, it just feels very muddled and it doesn't have that power that you probably want. So notice here that the G is a dissonant note. I placed it in the highest register. It doesn't have to be that way, but it works in this scenario because it's easier for the listener. Notice the choice of instruments, so the flute and the violin. Now I need to give proper harmonic context, so I have a D flat major chord, it's in second version. So within the strings I had to design the ambitus, so the bass is the very bottom on the A flat, and then the D flat is going to be in the violin 2, so it's kind of a perfect fourth relationship within the strings, and then there's some space to the violin 1. Likewise, with the woodwinds and French horns, notice the lowest note I chose was that A flat, concert A flat for the French horns, to the concert D flat in the clarinets, giving some space for the flute as well. So this is coming from harmony studies. So in harmony studies, we first learn about dissonance when it comes to the dominant seventh chords through proper resolution. Then when you get to seventh chords in generals, how to prepare it, how to resolve it. And especially when it comes to ninth chords, you learn to place the dissonance in a certain register so the listener can easily understand it. Now I'd like to discuss the amount of third required. So notice the orchestration is very perfect fifth heavy. So in the strings, we have cellos and violas on that perfect fifth. Notice that the third is in the violin 2 alone, and it's in its lowest register. When it comes to the French horns, we have the French horn 3 and 2 at the unison on that third with the violin 2. When it comes to the woodwinds, we have 2 separate registers, but notice we have no third at all, okay? Notice in this piano reduction that we have 3 octaves of the EB, 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 and the third alone is tucked in that middle register. So it's going to have a very, very specific effect. One of the reasons that we do harmony studies is because we start first with reposition chords in which we don't double the third usually, except for deceptive cadence. Then when you progress to the first inversion chords, you will find that the third, of course, is the bass. We usually don't double it, but certain cases we do. For example, for cadences, we'll double the third, as well as the Neapolitan sixth chord to bring out kind of the function of that chord. One of the consequences of this extensive training is that you understand all the different flavorings of the third, so when you go to orchestrate, you can get a really rich orchestration. Now I'd like to discuss what I call transformations over time. This is something I never had discussed in composition school. Notice that we go from a low elevation to a high elevation very quickly. With the strings, they change at measure 91. The cellos, violas, and double bass, they stay the same, but the violin 2 starts to expand. Then in measure 92, the violin 2 expands even more, but the double bass stays on the same note. But the other voices, notice that they have to redistribute themselves so the chord stays balanced. Then on the moment of change itself, notice that I had to orchestrate in two different manners. I have the upper part of the chord that had to sound good on its own, but then on the very downbeat, I had to integrate that with the lower part of the chord, but I had to make sure the lower part of the chord didn't overpower the upper part of the chord. Now let's talk about contrast of elevation. So in this example, notice that going across these two different chords, we have the highest note is the F natural, which is the root, and then we have the highest note is the C natural, which is the fifth. Completely different effects. Lowest note is the C natural, then the lowest note is the F natural. Very important, we have the drop of an octave and a perfect fourth between the highest notes of these two chords. Finally, when it comes to harmony, you're going to have to fill in those middle voices. You're going to have to balance the chord. So you're going to have a high soprano, and you may have to push up the bass. You're going to have a low bass, you may have the lower soprano, or you may recalibrate the alto and tenor so you have wider spacing to keep the chord balanced. Now I want to talk about the fact that not all chords are the same. When you're orchestrating, you have to actually hear, you cannot just assume just because it's a major chord that it's going to be similar to another major chord. In this particular orchestration, notice that we have a major chord moving to another major chord, and it's in parallel motion. Notice that we have parallel fifths in the bass, okay? Be really careful of a false understanding of harmony, which is very intellectual. Someone who would say, oh, there's parallel fifths. That's because certainly in beginning harmony studies, we do not allow parallel fifths. But the point of harmony studies is to build up your inner ear and to really get you to hear doublings so that when you orchestrate, you can do what you want. Obviously, WC had no issue with parallel fifths, okay? Notice the orchestration with the strings is mostly Divisi, okay? So the only non-Divisi instruments are the violin 1, so it's probably going to feel like the melody because it's all on that one note, and the double bass because we like to have a clear bass. Notice the orchestration of intervals, so we have perfect fourths and perfect fifths. Probably makes sense because we have that parallel motion that I was just talking about. So notice that the cellos on the perfect fifth, violas on the perfect fifth, and the violin 2 on the perfect fourth. So there are many, many, many different ways to do your orchestration. Notice, because all these instruments are on the perfect fourth, perfect fifth, violin 1 alone is on the third. So it's going to sound like the melody, and there's going to be a special effect because of that. Now I'd like to discuss what I call the heart of a chord. So when you're orchestrating, you have to have a pretty good idea of the harmony that you're working with. So if you look at the piano reduction, notice we have two parts of the chord. We have this lower part, E flat major, second inversion, and the upper part, which is this suspended chord, okay? Notice the orchestration. So the bottom of the chord, I put directly in the trombones whenever possible. You want to put them in the same group and the same instruments whenever possible. Then I have the tuba down the octave, okay? Notice the cellos and double basses. I didn't want to split the cellos at 3, which is going to thin out the sound, so I had to put them in the upper part of the chord, and I had to have the double basses in octaves. A little bit risky, but we'll wait for the live performance. Now, let's talk about the upper part of the chord. So with the woodwinds, I had to design their own abatus. So from the clarinet 2 all the way up to the flute 1. So I had to decide the highest note, which is going to be the flute 1 on the E flat. And I also had to decide the lowest note, which is that clarinet 2 on the E flat. Because of this, I need to have unison. So notice that clarinet 1 to oboe 2, we have the concert A flat, and oboe 1 and flute 2, we have the concert B flat. Part of the reason for this is that I wanted to make sure that there's space for the woodwinds to breathe in relationship to the brass. So when you do harmony studies in the French style, it's going to be 4 voices, so it's much simpler, but unisons come in to play very quickly. For example, for this type of cadence, many times you'll have a unison between alto and soprano, and also when you have a high bass, you may have a unison between the bass and the tenor. Okay, so the final thing I'll share with you is something that I never learned in America, but something that I have to do all the time when I orchestrate, and it's what I call adjusting the accompaniment. So notice when the accompaniment is by itself, notice the abatus. So we have the cellos on that B, and we have the F sharp in the highest voice, which is going to be the violin 2, which is kind of the de facto melody. Notice how I have to fill it in with tightly spaced intervals. Thereafter, when the melody arrives, notice how I had to adjust the accompaniment again. So notice that the violin is now on that B. Okay, so it's kind of widened the impetus. The cellos are still in the same lowest note, but notice I had to redistribute filling in the chord. The cellos now have that perfect fifth. Finally, notice the distance from the top of the accompaniment to the bottom of the melody. Notice we have the violin 2 on that B, and it's a third away from the concert D sharp and the trumpet. Another thing you have to think about are frequent adjustments of your accompaniment. Notice that when I bring in this new melody, it's in lower register, so the accompaniment has to adjust. So notice the strings, first off, I had to reinforce the bass with the double bass of the unison of the cello. I had to contract the accompaniment in the violas, and also notice later when I go to measure 188, I go back to the original spacing of the accompaniment. So all of this is coming from harmony. In harmony studies, you have to fill in the bass and soprano once you've figured out the outer voices, and sometimes you need tighter spacing, and other times you're going to need wider spacing.